Someone who'd count yourself as trauma-informed? Are you adversity aware? Are you still struggling and finding yourself grappling with the day-to-day impact of early trauma on the lives of young people you're supporting? Are you struggling to manage the fallout, confused by behaviours that seem unpredictable, hard to manage, and that come out of nowhere? Or maybe you're completely new to trauma and supporting young people from challenging backgrounds and you need a place to start. If so, this video is going to help bring you some clarity, some tools to help you on your journey. Supporting lots of individuals whose lives were profoundly shaped by their early experiences. Many of those people got caught into a cycle of incarceration, release and reoffending and spent decades coming in and out of prison, often starting when they were 15 years old. People seem to struggle to rebuild their lives and find stability. They seem to become institutionalised and used to the routine and structure in prison. As much as they hated it, they'd adapted to the routine of being in custody. I'm Alex. I'm a forensic psychologist who specialises in young people with a history of trauma, challenging and antisocial behaviour. Today's focus is trauma. By the end of this video, you're going to gain a clear understanding of what trauma is, the different ways we explain it and understand it. You'll understand more about the rates of trauma in the UK, as well as how they affect different groups and populations of people. We're going to look at some approaches to try and help young people who've experienced trauma and give you ways to think about applying it to your jobs in your sector. In today's society, we throw around a lot of acronyms and names for descriptions that all seem to mean the same thing. Trauma, ACEs, maltreatment, abuse. Do they all mean the same thing or are they different? Let's have a look into some of the ones that are most appropriate for us. Trauma is derived from a Greek word. I have no idea how to pronounce that. It was initially used to describe a physical wound. However, the definitions evolved since the late 1800s to describe psychological responses to distressing events. In modern terms, trauma occurs when someone experiences a one-off event or a series of events that overwhelm their physical and psychological capacity to cope. But what we need to keep in mind is that trauma is subjective. What one person finds traumatic, another person might not. Someone might experience the exact same challenges but not be traumatized. So it's important to remember it's not the trauma itself, it's the way it's experienced by the individual and the meaning they made from it. Trauma can stem from one-off incidents, like we said, like car crashes, natural disasters, or from repeated exposure to harmful experiences like abuse, neglect, relationship violence. So let's think about some key terms that are important for us working with young people. In today's society, we throw around a lot of acronyms and names for descriptions that all seem to mean the same thing. Trauma, ACEs, maltreatment, abuse. Do they all mean the same thing or are they different? Let's have a look into some of the ones that are most appropriate for us. First one is developmental trauma. This means repeated exposure to prolonged stress during childhood. Research and common sense tells us that going through trauma in your early life is going to disrupt your emotional, cognitive and physical development. Another key term used often is childhood emotional neglect. This occurs primarily in caregiver relationships, when a caregiver fails to give emotional support or validation to a child. This can leave them feeling worthless, emotionally empty. This pattern often takes roots in that critical period we were talking about, that first 1,000 days. It forms the blueprint for all future relationships. Without intervention, this template for relationships can continue in life and lead to lifelong challenges in forming, trusting, maintaining healthy romantic and social connections. Post-traumatic stress, PTSD. Well, this is a mental health diagnosis, a condition that happens after a person's experienced an event or series of events. The symptoms are flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance and an intense feeling of anxiety. This diagnosis is often given to people who are facing ongoing mental health struggles that make living exceptionally difficult. The next one's complex trauma, which refers to a pattern of repeated and prolonged exposure to a number of different events, particularly those within relationships, such as abuse, neglect. These experiences often start in childhood but can disrupt emotional development, attachment and trust. Complex trauma can shape how an individual views themselves, often negatively, views the world as a dangerous and untrustworthy place, and can lead to difficulties in understanding and managing emotions, building relationships, physical and mental well-being. Obviously, it's different from single event trauma because it's ongoing. One of the ones people don't often talk about is intergenerational trauma. This is the transmission of trauma across generations. We see that it impacts individuals through genetics, psychological or environmental factors. This can include things like learned behaviour, unresolved psychological issues and emotional wounds in the caregivers. This can often influence future generations' perceived reaction to stress. The cycle continues down family lines, potentially leading to mental health challenges, negative coping strategies, and can disrupt relationships, affecting the overall well-being of future generations. So which one of those definitions makes most sense to you, in your life, in your field? And what do you think of all these broad definitions? Are they helpful or not? Let me know in the comments. So what we've explored so far is the different definitions and how they impact people. But trauma's everywhere in today's conversations, especially the term ACEs. Do you know what the ACEs are? Have you heard of them? Do you know how they're different from what we've discussed so far? If you don't, stay tuned because I'm about to tell you. ACEs refer to specific traumatic events that occur in childhood. Unfortunately, ACEs are far more common than many people think. In England and Wales, nearly 50% of individuals report experiencing at least one ACE. If we apply this across the UK, we can see that one ACE affects over 33 million people. But what are ACEs and how difficult are they to measure? There are different definitions varying across different regions and disciplines, making it hard to get a consistent idea of the data. Think about it. How comfortable would you be to delve into the negative parts of your childhood, your history, sharing potentially traumatic experiences with a researcher, a government agency, a survey, or a questionnaire? Obviously, getting good data is difficult. Some people don't even recognise their experiences as neglectful or abusive. They've normalised their experiences and don't see what they've been through as traumatic. This can make it very difficult to find accurate measurement of prevalence and understanding how it affects communities. However, there is some good data out there that can help us gauge the problem. All we need to do is take into account the idea that the data is only as good as the methods used to collect it. So the stats we're going to talk about now are quite old. They're from 2014, 2016. One of them is the National Household Survey of ACEs in England and the other's the National ACEs Study in Wales. Both of those articles and some interesting resources are in the description. Make sure you check them out. So, if 50% of people have experienced at least one ACE, how common are the other forms of trauma and how widespread are they within our communities? Researchers on ACEs have been consistently replicated, meaning that when other researchers apply the same methods, they achieve similar results. So we can think about ACEs in two different ways, the things that young people experience themselves and things that they experience in their household. So what are the ACEs? Growing up in environments where people are victims of violence or sexual abuse. Growing up in households where name-calling, emotionally harmful words and actions are regular. Living in households where there isn't enough food, access to healthcare, warmth or other essential goods for living. Emotional neglect. Growing up in homes where there is a lack of emotional warmth, connection and care. So the household ACEs and the things that people go through in their homes tend to be things like having a parent who has a mental health difficulty, living with people who have a problem with addiction, such as alcohol or drugs, growing up in a home where people witness violence in relationships in whatever forms that takes, having a caregiver who spent time in prison during your childhood. Separated parents has also been seen to be an ACE. What do you guys think of that? Research shows that experiencing 4 or more ACEs is strongly linked to having illnesses, disease and shorter life expectancy. In England, 9% of adults, around 4 million people, report 4 or more ACEs. In Wales and Scotland, that figure rises to 14%. If we extrapolate this data to Northern Ireland, this suggests that over 4.5 million people in the UK have experienced that crucial number of 4 or more ACEs. This increases their chances of various physical, social and emotional challenges. But we do know there's a dose-dependent effect to ACEs. The more ACEs you have, the more vulnerability to challenges you have later. There's also a clustering effect, which means that people who experience one ACE are at increased likelihood of experiencing more ACEs. So I've mentioned the outcomes of trauma several times, but let's take a moment to focus on the illnesses and diseases that are linked to childhood trauma. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I'll display some graphs in the background to highlight the physical and mental health issues faced by people who experience ACEs in childhood. Physical health problems like heart disease, cancer, lung disease, and lots more. Mental health consequences are things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, and personality disorders. Not everyone who experiences ACEs will have the same negative health outcomes. Factors such as the type of ACEs you've experienced, the duration that you were exposed to them, and the way in which you were supported can seriously reduce all these risks. But now we've got to think a little bit outside the home, because we know the environment plays a significant role. Areas with high deprivation, high poverty, high crime, high drugs, low jobs, poor housing, discrimination are known as adverse community environments. Play a key role in shaping how a person grows. Obviously, you've got challenges in your home. Well, what's it like if you live in an environment outside of the home that's similar or matched? In 2024, growing up in poverty was at an all-time high. 36% of young people are growing up below the poverty line. For households with 3 or more children, the stats increased significantly to 56% of children living in poverty. When we add this community component to the challenges children face at home, you can see how this creates the perfect storm of social, emotional and behavioural challenges. If young people aren't feeling safe in their home or in their communities, where can they feel safe? And how's this going to affect how they carry themselves? Things get especially thought-provoking when you look at the prevalence rates of ACEs amongst high-risk groups, like people who've ended up in custody. Remember that figure from the general population? Well, people who end up serving time in custody are 5 times more likely to have endured 4 or more ACEs. Incarceration increases the chances of them having 4 or more ACEs by 400%. For every 1 person in the general population who has 4 or more ACEs, there are 5 people in prison settings that have the same. These statistics are a stark warning to us. We know that traumatized young people often externalize their challenges through their behavior. These behaviors often harm themselves and the community, both in the short and the long term. We need to help people think about healing from ACEs. We need a coordinated effort from all the people who have involvement in children's lives. We need to find places and ways of offering safety, security, and opportunities for healing and growth. It's not just about being compassionate. It's a necessary investment in breaking the cycle and trauma and its far-reaching effects. If we continue to fund these revolving door services for a population deeply affected by their childhood, it's going to be costly, it's going to be lifelong, and inevitably unsustainable. Young boys and young men likely end up stuck in a cycle of prison, and young women and girls end up in psychiatric units and community mental health settings. We know that preventative measures and targeted support can create meaningful change and avoid perpetuating the cycle. What does the scientific community say about the challenges we face in 2025? We're also starting to consider the role of smaller everyday stressors known as little t traumas. These are the ongoing, less severe experiences that can accumulate over time and have a significant effect on your physical and mental health. These include experiences like bullying, chronic rejection, emotional neglect, financial stress. Whilst these events may not appear as severe as the major traumas, their cumulative effect can have a significant impact on somebody's development, especially when they experience it over long and protracted periods. In 2025, the field of trauma research is evolving to consider a broader range of experiences, including little t traumas. In my other video on neurobiology of trauma, we think a bit about the mechanisms of stress and how they impact the body and brain to provide some insights into why those small t traumas, as well as the big T traumas, can have such significant effects on somebody's morbidity and mortality. So what have we learned about trauma and ACEs? Specifically, what will help us understand and work with traumatized young people better? We know that the effects of ACEs can be far-reaching. However, with the right intervention, the right support, the right time, and the right community engagement, we can really help young people overcome these challenges and build healthier, more fulfilling lives. We need to focus on building people's strengths, celebrating progress and success, and offering opportunities for personal growth. We want to help individuals try and break the cycle of trauma. Things like trauma-informed care, trauma-informed principles, combined with long-term support and systemic change, can provide a pathway to healing and resilience. We need understanding, compassion, and a collaborative approach to empower individuals to create brighter futures for themselves. We need to think about long-term healing and systemic support, including consistent access to therapy, Community involvement like sports and games is crucial for someone to build resilience and thrive through support. Trauma-informed policies in schools, healthcare settings and social services could create an environment where young people feel safe, understood, empowered and build a successful future. So we just talked about how trauma in general affects the brain, but how does that actually happen? What is the mechanism by which trauma affects brain development? To answer that, we need to do a bit of a deep dive into how our brains shape and adapt to our environments, whether they're positive or negative. We've obviously established the long-term health impacts. Why does that happen? How is it that going through something in your early childhood can remap the way your body and brain works? If you really want to get into that, jump into my next video about trauma and the brain. We're looking deep at neurobiology and hormones to understand the mechanisms for change and think about ways of managing and preventing that. If you're affected by any of the content in today's video, there are links in the description with contact details for support services in the UK and around the world.